Well, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Zoellner, Lehigh Teaching Museum. Scott Sherk, SonanceZOELLNER, is a collaborative sound sculpture celebrating 20 years of Zoellner. For the longest time, I want to do a project with Scott at Lehigh, dealing with sound. He is known and his work have been exhibited widely and have been favorably reviewed by the New York Times, Art Forum, and other publications. The installation at Zoellner that transformed our space into a sculpture sound environment was commissioned by Lehigh Teaching Museum. As well, Scott is a visiting artist at the Art, Architecture and Design at the AAD, where he's challenging students and faculty alike to experience space as another element of form where sound could play an integral part. After all, sound sculpture have been with us forever. For example, standing trees, flagpoles, buildings, waterfalls, bridges, animals, and many other natural and man-made elements. I'd like to welcome Scott Sherk.
Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks to Ricardo for inviting me and all the great help I've gotten from his staff, Mark, Jeff, and the whole rest of the LUAG staff, as well as Phil, and the audio help that he's given me has been great. Anyway, SonanceZOELLNER, it's been an over a year-long process putting this together. I'm going to try to talk really quickly, too, because apparently there's a time limit on how long the piece itself can be left on tonight, because there's some other programs going on. So I'll try to talk really fast, so if I get too fast, slow me down. I'm not used to giving gallery talks where people actually get to sit down. Usually they're standing up, and so I speak even faster. But what I wanted to do here was make a sound sculpture that included the sound of the space itself. And so you see here, this is a map of the Zoellner building itself. And I identified 6 sites that I thought were interesting. They're kind of spread throughout the building, and one of them's outside. They were interesting because they were distributed spatially in a very nice way, but they also had electrical outlets next to them. So I was very excited to put this together, and as Ricardo and I talked about, we wanted the building to become kind of an instrument where it would speak to you as you moved around. You could move from different areas, and the sounds would resonate, and the building itself would come alive with sound. The response wasn't exactly what I anticipated. Let me just read this out loud because I love the biblical quality of it. For 8 days, Zoellner Art Center was filled with sound and color as artist Scott Sherk's interactive sonance-zoellner sculpture greeted guests and passerbys. On the 9th day, the sculpture fell silent, its power cord cut by an unknown vandal. Interesting, not exactly what I expected. And I'd like to do 2 things. I'd like to talk a little bit about how I got to the point of making this piece, where some of the ideas have come from, as well as have maybe a brief discussion about just the idea of vandalism of art itself and the idea of sound and people's response to it, which clearly is unpredictable. I was trained as a sculptor, and I began making sound sculpture, things doing with sound, several years ago when I bought this thing. This is called an iRiver, and it's an MP3 player. Remember those? This is before smartphones. And I bought it because I didn't want to buy an Apple device for some reason. I've since converted, but at the time I didn't want to buy an Apple device. So I bought this thing, and I discovered in going through its menu one day that it could make recordings. So I started walking around making recordings and listening to them in headphones, and it occurred to me that sound, in fact, describes and articulates space in a way that I found more palpable and more real than vision itself. And just as an example, if you walk into a room with your eyes closed and you clap your hands, you can pretty much tell, is it a small room, a large room, what the wall coverings are like. Those kind of experiences, I thought, sounded like sculptural experiences. If you can manipulate space, if you can change one's perception of space and play with it, that's what sculpture does. And I thought that's something I could do with sound. So my techniques got better. I got rid of the iRiver, and this is actually a really great recording device, which I've used here in Zoellner and made several hours of recordings in different places around the building. A lot of this kind of work comes from my first forays into sound sculpture. I started making sound walks. I would take a walk, and as I walked, I had a GPS which would record everywhere I went. And then I would take samples, little pieces of dirt, little pieces of stones and things, and I made sound boxes like this. This sound box has a couple of samples of leaves and water because it was raining, but it also has a sculpture, that metal thing, which is a representation of the walk I took. I used my GPS, I printed out the coordinates, and I welded together a little sculpture. And then it also had a CD player because I made a recording of the space itself. And my feeling was if you listened to the recording while looking at this, you would get a real sense of what the soundscape was and what the landscape was. And I felt that was a pretty successful way to work. I made a lot of those sound walks. This one is from Fifth Avenue. It's called Museum Mile. And it starts with up in Harlem and goes down through past the Met, which has got a lot more hills to it than you think, actually. As I was doing those sound maps, I became interested in finding ways to represent sound. And in doing that, if you see in the upper right side of this piece, or something that's called a spectrogram, which I discovered is something that was made available to a layperson like me through Cornell School of Ornithology. They put together the software so that you could identify bird calls. But what it is this interesting thing where it plots out a sound where you can see frequency over time. And I started to make spectrograms of the recordings I was doing, and I started to find some really interesting things that were happening in sound even when there wasn't any sound. I became very interested in just not necessarily bird calls or cars going by or sirens going off, but just those moments between incidents of sound, like right now. Where we can hear the air conditioning, we hear some instrument off in the background, and it gets layered more and more. All sorts of stuff's going on. Those kinds of things became important for a piece that I did with Pat Batt recently in August and September this year. A piece called Cor e Son in the castle of Evermonte in Portugal. And it was a piece that we took everything out of the castle and we presented just color, which came through the windows, and the sound, which was ambient recordings I had made of the area, which I played back in the space. And it was an incredibly resonant space, and I found it really exciting to kind of work within that. I'm going to just play a moment or two of this video to give you a little idea of what that sounded like. That's the castle. It's an incredibly ugly castle. It's 14th century. the sound of the wind, which in the piece, it was a 4-channel surround piece, so the wind would move back and forth. Treated all the windows with color, so we had the warmth of the ground and the coolness of the sky. But as you can see, it's just a great big empty stone space that resonated like crazy. And I really love that kind of resonance that it made. And I wanted to work with that kind of sound a little bit more. You can see it's a defensive castle. You can really see everything around. This video, if you want to see the whole video, it's on our website, thethirdbarn.org, so you can check out the rest of it. So the idea of ambient sound, the idea of a spectrogram, which is a way of kind of visualizing the sound and seeing what's going on, became really important with the work that I did here in Zoellner. I'm going to play this for a while because this is in fact an actual spectrogram, and this is the second floor alcove. So this is a recording between the bathrooms down the hallway. And if you notice, those black lines, those horizontal lines are the dominant frequencies, the kind of drone-like frequencies. I would take the sound and I would stretch it out and I would squash it, and I'd stretch it out and I'd squash it. And I'd get rid of the incidents, the transients, the things that start and stop, and I'd try to make them into long things, sort of average it out so I could see the most prevalent and most dominant sounds that are going on. This is the lobby of Lehigh, and you can see the lower black bands are the lower frequencies. There's a really loud HVAC system there. It's just pumping away, and you can see those things happen in regular intervals. This is up by the theater across the way. It also has some really dominant, these dark clouds are loud drone frequencies, which are happening all the time. That's what we're hearing. Some of them are below the range of hearing, and some of them, as you can see, are way up above the realm of hearing. This is the window right back there. The sounds that you're hearing are the sounds of this building. Skip ahead. These are examples of how I filtered. Where you can see I'm just taking those particular frequencies from those dominant bands. It's like a notch filter, or not everything else but that. And so using just the available sounds of the building itself, I was able to make something. And what I've made, I kind of think very much like, is sort of like a sculpture by Rachel Whitread, who's one of my favorite artists. And what she does is she makes negative spaces. It's called Ghost. It's actually somebody's study. That if you can imagine that she took somebody's room and she filled it with plaster and then removed the building, and you're left with the plaster. You can kind of see the windows on the right, and that's the fireplace, the negative fireplace. So I kind of think of what I'm trying to do is kind of doing that, kind of taking the sound of the room and filling the room with it again. So it becomes a kind of palpable thing within the room, something that's barely audible suddenly becomes palpable. And to do that, I built 5 special sound units which are distributed around the building. Each of them are stereo units which have a little amplifier inside and a little thumb drive that plays the sound. The places they've been distributed are the north and south windows on this floor. On the lower right, between the bathrooms halfway down the hall, and then the main lobby and the LUAG lobby. And then my first idea, and the thing I had a whole lot of fun with, was also making a piece inside the circular vent outside the front door of the LUAG gallery. And this piece, the idea really came to me as an homage to Max Neuhaus, who is one of the most interesting and important sound artists that I know of. Died a couple years ago. He made this piece in Times Square. This is Times Square. And he and some friends one night arrived with a panel van and some orange cones, and they climbed down into these vents and hooked up 6 oscillators, which they hacked into the subway, the New York subway power grid. And then they came back out and they closed it, and they didn't tell anybody about it. And for about 10 years, this piece existed without anybody knowing about it in New York. This wonderful humming sound that was tuned to the space itself. Eventually, somebody found out about it, they ripped it out. But shortly before Max Neuhaus died, the Dia Foundation paid for restoring it. So it exists there now. There's no signage, there's no indication that anything's there. If you ever want to find it, I can tell you how to find it. But it's one of the most spectacular pieces, and I've been very moved by this piece, as well as being moved by Max Neuhaus, who was in fact a drummer. So I made this piece, thinking about Max. And this is the underground area there, where I have to say I spent about 2 days, and it was horrifying to be underneath there. But that piece, which also has lights, LED lights, which are reflective of the volume of the sound itself, which as it gets darker you'll be able to see a little bit more clearly, contains both the sounds of the outdoors. I made a lot of recordings out there. There's a lot of traffic which gets scrunched into a drone. There's often the sound of the flagpole. There's the thing that bangs against the flagpole, and it's a high frequency thing. You'll hear that, but it's all turned into tones. And I added to that, as in direct homage to Max, the sound of somebody practicing the drums, which was me. So every now and then you'll hear occasionally the sound of somebody practicing the drums, which I think of as Max down there. But these pieces, all this work, develops out of a collection of sound art pioneers. And before we go and experience my piece, I'd just like to briefly talk a little bit about them and who they were and how it relates to what I've done. Luigi Russolo was a futurist, and he wrote a manifesto called The Art of Noise. And he was the first person that kind of came up with the idea of, why don't we just organize noise in ways that could be interesting? And he made this thing called intonarumori. My Italian's not so good. And intonarumori was an orchestra of sound-making instruments. These things, you crank them, they ratchets make things, you bang them, they make sounds. And he performed it at least twice, and both times a riot ensued. John Cage, hugely important for the development of sound as something that can be a material that can be worked with by itself. His groundbreaking piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, was a piece he wrote for David Tudor, the pianist, and it consisted of David Tudor walking out, sitting down at the piano, opening the piano, sitting there for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and closing the piano and walking off. When that was first performed, it basically generated a riot as well. Not a good response, but it was a huge thing to be able to spend 4 minutes and 33 seconds just listening to the world around you. which is, I find, an incredibly moving and beautiful thing. R. Murray Schafer was a composer and researcher in Vancouver, Canada, and he started this thing called the World Soundscape Project. He recruited his graduate students to go around Vancouver and make recordings of it, because he felt that the world was changing so quickly that we needed to both preserve the sounds that were important sounds of an area. He called them soundscapes, to create, to somehow preserve those soundscapes, as well as make us all aware, more critically aware of what's happening in the world of sound. And particularly pointing towards architects and designers to build this into their own work and designs. And Alvin Lucier is one of my favorite artists. Alvin Lucier is still with us. His important piece for me is called I'm Sitting in a Room. And this is Alvin Lucier performing it at the Museum of Modern Art. And what it consists of is he speaks into a microphone a couple of phrases. I'm sitting in a room and talking to this microphone. And then that's recorded, and then it's played back. And as it's played back, what's being played back gets recorded. And this goes on and on and on, and after 45 minutes, it turns into just a hum, which is the resonance of the room itself. The room tone, the natural resonance of the room takes over. And I found that a really inspirational and powerful piece for my purposes. Anea Lockwood is another artist. She visited Muhlenberg a couple of years ago. Anea Lockwood began her career as a notorious composer by setting pianos on fire, which you see in the upper left, and that created a certain amount of outrage. Now she's going around and recording all of the rivers that she can find. This is the Housatonic River. She calls it a sound walk of the Housatonic River. She's done the Hudson River. She presented the Danube River at Muhlenberg College, which was really exciting. And just the way she uses natural sound and kind of site-specific sound has been really important for my work. And finally, the first sound piece that I ever saw, actually, was this guy, Bernhard Langer. And this piece, several years ago, Pat and our daughter, we went to Parc Villette in Paris, which was Bernard Tschumi had recently put, I think, maybe 15 brilliantly red pavilions on a grid all throughout the park. So it was a beautiful place to visit. I hope it's weathered well. But tucked then within this was this sort of cement circle, which was the most astonishing thing. It's a sound work by Bernhard Langer, and it's the sound of water and some tones and drones, and you just sort of discover this thing in the middle of a grove of trees, and it was powerful and beautiful. Those are my inspiring predecessors. Before I go on, I need to do a little bit of promo. I want you to know that I have a CD that's being released this week, which will be available from 3leaves.com, should you be interested. And it is a work that's based on the presentation that Pat and I did in Portugal. And also downstairs, Pat and I have a piece in the local artist show, which I hope that if you haven't seen, you'll get a chance to see. And finally, Pat and I also have an installation right now at Lebanon Valley College. It's called Edges and Transitions, and it's a multimedia piece with surround sound, projections, paintings, that's based on our experiences in Malta and our meditations on the idea of edges and borders and transitions. And that's up through the middle of May. Anyway, we have to talk about vandalism a little bit. This is the evidence right now. And this is the piece, somebody who could have easily unplugged one of the sculptures if it was offending them. I hope they unplugged it first, but they not just unplugged it, but they cut the cord, which is a deliberate act of destruction. And that's, I'm personally hurt by it, of course, but more than that, I think the idea of vandalizing art, particularly in this era, in this time where we seem to be growing increasingly intolerant, is something that needs to be addressed. And I know that as a part of that, I've thought a lot about, sound, and I've been surprised about people's response to it. Some people have been very positive and some people haven't. And I realized, I ran across this quote, Michael Sheehan, who's quoting Pierre Schaeffer, the founder of Musique Concrète. He says, "A sound object is a meeting point of an acoustic action and a listening intention." And Andrew Hill, in a recent piece in Organized Sound, said, "Every sound heard has been mediated and interpreted by the individual." And I've come to realize that as neutral as my sounds have been to me, my thought that, well, there's some sweet irony here. If people are objecting to the sound, it's the sound that's already there. There's nothing new, it's just the thing itself. But I do realize that sound is something we don't have earlids, we have eyelids. And there's something to be said for not being able to not hear something. Although, in fact, our brains do this all the time. But I also think that it's interesting, and I find it kind of fascinating, that the response that some people would have that be so negatively affected by something says something about the act of interpretation, and I find that a fascinating thing and something I'd like to explore more as we go forward. And just to conclude, so we do have some time to walk around and listen to the pieces. I did a Google search on recent acts of art vandalism. So thanks everybody. Let's hold our applause. Let's just, all of us, silently walk through the building and hear the piece. I would really appreciate that. So, can we do that? Spend 2 minutes just walking through.
Our building is far more fascinating. Chandler Elman with a couple of ball peen hammers hitting the pipes, and we can bet orchestra going on.